All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar series on recovery and resiliency on Main Street. I am Kimberly Parsons Whitaker. Connecticut Main Street Center is the expert resource for developing and sustaining vibrant downtowns that fuel our state's prosperity. Our mission is to assess, to educate, to convene, and to advocate to develop and grow our traditional downtowns, village centers, and urban mixed-use neighborhoods. Given the impact of and the challenges caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, we are continuing to program our theme of recovery and resiliency on Main Street. Today's program is the future of Main Street retail. A couple of housekeeping notes for you. Today's session will run approximately 1 hour. Please do feel free to type any questions you have in the chat function as we go. We're going to be monitoring the chat box, and we'll have our speaker address questions when we pause for Q&A. A recording of today's session will be available on our website at ctmainstreet.org, as are all of our workshop archives. And finally, you'll receive a brief evaluation in the next day or so. We greatly appreciate your input so we can continually improve these sessions. And a reminder for planners, evaluations are required for AICP CM credits. A few big thank yous here. We are grateful to our sponsors. Our educational programs, Main Street Forums for the 21st Century, are sponsored by Webster Bank, Avangrid, and Farmington Bank Community Foundation. Our corporate investors are People's United Bank, Capital for Change, Windsor Federal, and M&T Bank. Connecticut Main Street Center's founding sponsors are Eversource and the State of Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development. And our growth partners are Avangrid and the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office. Connecticut Main Street Center also has some important strategic partnerships, including our partnership with the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, for which we provide educational programs that qualify for the Certified Connecticut Municipal Official Program. And our AICP certification maintenance provider is FHI Studio. And now, an introduction. Michael J. Byrne is one of North America's leading experts and futurists on urban and downtown Main Street districts, as well as the retail industry more generally. As founder and president of MJB Consulting, Mike has amassed more than 20 years' experience in conducting retail market analyses, devising tenanting strategies, and spearheading implementation efforts across the US, Canada, and the UK. Mike has worked in communities large and small, in big city downtowns and rural main streets, in pedestrian-oriented settings and automobile-dependent ones. And the best way I can introduce Mike is to quote our old friend John Shapiro, the chair of Pratt Institute's Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment. John says, Mike Byrne is, for me, the go-to person for anything having to do with retail and downtowns. He gets it from all perspectives: planning, policy, zoning, property owners, and especially retailers. And he backs it up with real data and insight informed by decades of work across the US. It is now my pleasure to introduce Michael Byrne.
Thank you, Kim. You can hear me all right? Great. Yep. Well, good morning, everyone. Let me start by quoting a professor of psychology at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, whose name is Frederic Grosse. Sorry for the mangled French. And Professor Grosse said, humans are terrible at predicting the effect big events will have on them. Positive events often don't make them as happy as they thought for as long as they hoped, while they end up getting through negative events they were convinced they would never survive. That pretty much sums up the prevailing attitudes as we start to emerge from the last year and a half. And I want to spend the next 40 or so minutes trying to get us to a more data-driven and hopefully more uplifting place in that little corner of the world where I focus most of my time, the world of downtown and Main Street retail. You can go ahead to the first slide. Oh, you already are on it. Great. So we hear this phrase new normal a lot these days from a lot of forecasters and pundits who, based on surveys, modeling, or outright laziness, assume that the future will merely be an extrapolation of the present. But the one thing we know for certain is that, at least in retail, It won't be. Retail is the most intricate and fast-moving property type there is. It does not stand still. It does not move in a straight line. It twists and turns. It goes in directions most people never would have predicted. So it's when we confidently predict a future based on simply an extrapolation of the present that we run into problems. Which gets me to one of my favorite quotes from one of Connecticut's favorite sons, Mark Twain. Though you might have first read it or heard it at the beginning of the movie The Big Short, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. The reality is that always with retail, but especially right now, there's still so much we still do not know, or that we think or we're sure we know, but where we are likely to be wrong. And in the end, to draw on another famous saying, there are things we can change, things we can't and must accept. Hopefully today I'll provide you with at least a little bit of wisdom for knowing the difference. Let's go to the next slide. So looking back at the spring 2020, things were pretty scary on so many levels. Certainly for our downtowns and main streets. We were faced with empty offices and campuses if we had universities. There was a complete collapse in tourism. But also our downtowns had become so dependent on this experiential economy, food and beverage, entertainment, fitness, personal services. We'd become so dependent on it, and that was exactly what received a gut punch from this pandemic. Also, many of our downtowns are filled with small businesses, and there was the expectation that, hey, how are they ever going to make it through this? Next slide. Fast forward 18 months, and well, the narrative all too often still reflects that spring 2020 mindset. And few people stop to realize that, hey, amidst all of this tragedy and trauma, and there was quite a bit of that, there are at least a few things to be happy about, a few things that our country, our economy, and our culture did really, really well. For one thing, this was not an extinction level event for downtown retail. Far, far from it. Let's just look at restaurants, which have probably received the most attention. The forecasts were indeed quite dire. The one that probably got the most press because it sounded the most alarming was from the Independent Restaurant Coalition, which projected that as many as 85% of independent restaurants would close. And don't get me wrong, this was a historically bad year for restaurants. An average year, restaurants in this country generate revenue of about $909 billion, or at least that's what was expected at the beginning of 2020. In the course of the year, they only generated revenue of about $669 billion. So there was a $240 billion shortfall. That's massive. But looking at it another way, 90,000 restaurants permanently or temporarily closed. Sorry, permanently or closed either permanently or long-term. Whatever long-term really means. This is statistics from the National Restaurant Association. They originally said 110,000. They decreased it to 90,000. 90,000 is a lot of restaurants, but consider that this is the restaurant business. In an average year, 50,000 restaurants close, right? And what those statistics that the National Restaurant Association put out there never reported was that 70,000 restaurants opened in 2020. And that's not all that bad compared to the 83,000 that normally open in a given year. So just to review, 90,000 restaurants closed permanently or long-term. Still not sure what long-term means. That doesn't mean they're permanently closed. Versus 50,000 in an average year. 70,000 restaurants opened versus 83,000 in an average year. Okay, so a net loss of 20,000 restaurants. Not good, not cataclysmic. All right. If we just look at Connecticut, the articles here have routinely pointed to a piece of data saying that 600 restaurants either closed permanently or long-term. This is from the Connecticut Restaurant Association, out of 8,500 across the state. I make that calculation, that's 7%. That's lower than in an average year, right? And in many cities, actually more restaurants open than closed. In New Haven, 32 open, 21 closed between March and February. West Hartford, 12 open, 6 closed. Stamford, more open than closed. Now, to some degree, this should not have been a surprise. This disconnect between what was being projected and what actually happened. The National Restaurant Association was doing a little bit of posturing and negotiating, and it worked, right? The scare tactic worked. They ultimately got the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, and we should be glad for that. Our downtowns and main streets depend on food and beverage, right? As I noted. So we should be glad for that. But the reality is that this was clearly not the cataclysmic apocalyptic event that had been feared in spring 2020. And we need to start correcting that record in our own minds and in the public dialogue. Next slide. So you might ask, how is this possible? I mean, how is there that shortfall in revenue and yet so few restaurants actually closed? Well, if we expand this to all small businesses and we wonder how many of them survived, there's a host of reasons, and they generally fall into one of several buckets. Obviously, off-premise dining, whether takeout and delivery, made a huge difference. A lot of restaurants upgraded their infrastructure in that regard. Outdoor dining and selling, we all know what impact that had, but also changes, or temporary or otherwise, in laws which allowed restaurants to serve to-go alcohol. And also restaurants cultivated additional sources of revenue through wholesale accounts, whether it's from restaurants, for example, putting their sauces, spices, and meal kits on supermarket shelves. In the word of the day, they pivoted, and they pivoted effectively in a lot of cases, so that there were other revenue sources besides just walk-in traffic. Next slide. Also, one should not underestimate the massive amount of government assistance and the role that that played. And that's not just at the federal level with PPP and the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, also with stimulus checks, which boosted demand, and also with state grants, right? The state came through with a small business grant as well as a restaurant relief fund. Community goodwill and fundraising, particularly important on our main streets. There was a sort of new localism, kind of a circling the wagons around our small businesses, which sometimes even reflected itself, especially in more affluent communities, in some really impressive fundraising campaigns via GoFundMe to keep businesses afloat during this time. And we should not fail to credit property owners, many of which, not all, but many of which realized that we're all in this together and worked with their tenants on rent deferrals in exchange for longer leases, percentage rent in some cases. And they themselves were able to do this sometimes because they got concessions from their lenders, right? So all of this could explain to a significant extent why devastation wasn't as initially projected. Next slide. Another piece of this is that some retail categories and subcategories did even better than in a normal year. We certainly saw this in home, with furnishings and home improvement, kitchen, garden, but also toys, crafts, sporting goods. It was a very different lifestyle that we lived. It's not clear we'll keep living it, and that's a big unanswered question, which I'll get to later. But it was a very different lifestyle that we lived, and that actually benefited certain categories quite a bit to the point where some of them had their best years ever. Next slide. So you might be saying, what about that elephant in the room? What about e-commerce? Let's unpack that a little, okay? If you look at this chart, you'll see that at the beginning of 2020, e-commerce accounted for about 11.8% of all retail sales in the United States. All right. Then we heard tons and tons of headlines that we're going to see 10 years of e-commerce growth packed into 3 months, 6 months, whatever short time frame the article was referencing, right? Well, what actually happened? Well, amazingly, by the end of the year, that 11% had climbed to 14%. So it climbed 220 basis points, right? 2%. And that was stunning. If ever there was a year where you would expect e-commerce would pretty much dominate and really establish a dominant position for the future, it gained 2 percentage points, right? And consider that that 14% that's credited to e-commerce, That includes all of the online orders you made that you then picked up at the store. So if you actually take the percentage that was purely online, you ordered online, it was delivered to your doorstep, that was in single digits in 2020 during the pandemic, right? And part of this, I think, is just the fact that all of this online demand created enormous challenges with inventory management and logistics. And we all know what that was like. Orders arriving on our doorstep or curbside incomplete, delivery dates revised into the distant future, orders simply canceled. Even when they do arrive, they're sometimes pilfered by porch pirates. And then if you want to return them, it's one big pain in the you-know-what. I don't know about you, shopping for groceries online was for me a wholly dissatisfying and frustrating experience. We did this partly because we had to, right? Remember that point, as I'll return to it later. But also in certain categories, what we might be butting up against is there's a ceiling to how much we're willing to spend on that sort of merchandise online. You know, we heard a lot about how apparel, footwear, and accessory sales nosedived during COVID-19, and everyone assumed it was because we were not going out or we weren't going to office anymore, so why do we need clothes, right? And that's undoubtedly part of it. But it told me something else. Maybe apparel, footwear, and accessory sales nosedived during COVID-19 for the simple reason that consumers still prefer to shop for such merchandise in stores. And they were not really able to do that with all the forced closures, with all the capacity restrictions, with the health concerns, right? That's been my argument all along, even before COVID, that again, many of us just prefer to do this stuff in the store. In fact, some of us even enjoy doing it in the store as a form of leisure, right? Why would anyone go into a store if they could get it online? Ignores all of the psychology that drives us into stores. If retail was just about buying things we need in the most convenient way possible, it would not exist. Businesses would not make enough money. It's all about that psychology. And this notion that somehow e-commerce is going to be the way we shop for everything ignores that psychology. Next slide. Sorry. But what's another part of this, if we forget about the consumer, is that e-commerce also has to work for the business, right? We assume that if we, the consumer, want it this way, it's going to happen. Well, no, if we want it this way, it will happen if the business can make money. Because in the end, venture capital aside, businesses are in the business of making money. If they don't, they eventually will no longer exist, right? And the reality, which has been shown repeatedly, is that e-commerce for the business is one big money loser. If you combine the costs associated with shipping to everyone's doorstep, the costs of getting and keeping consumers, when you have to pay Facebook, Google, and Amazon's exorbitant advertising costs, because we basically set up an oligopoly with online advertising, and when you factor in how high of a percentage of online orders are ultimately returned, that's just an unsustainable cost structure that virtually no one has been able to figure out how to make money on. I said virtually no one. Even Amazon, until 2019, was still showing an operating loss on e-commerce, which is a shock to almost everyone. But the reality is that Amazon has always made almost all of its profit on the cloud, on cloud computing, on Amazon Web Services. Its e-commerce gets the most attention. But if split off onto its own, it's not that great of a business. And that's Amazon at its scale. When you think about it, that's Amazon at its scale. When you're at that scale, usually your costs go down. It's called economies of scale. Well, if you look at that chart, shipping costs for Amazon continue to rise 26 years after it was founded. So if Amazon is struggling with this, you can only imagine pretty much every other business, right? So what does all this mean? Next slide. Well, it means that e-commerce is not going away, but the only way it works, and this is the bright lining for all of us in the downtown Main Street world, the only way it works is in conjunction with a network of brick and mortar stores, because brick and mortar stores enable businesses to mitigate those high costs of shipping, customer acquisition, and returns. Just think about it. Now there's curbside pickup, right? That's cheaper for the business. Customer acquisition, you have storefronts which serve as billboards, as advertising, right? That keep you on people's minds, right? That's what you get from stores. And then we tend to return only 1/4 as many of our purchases when we buy them in store, as opposed to online. So having stores is how you make this all work. It's how you make the numbers pencil. Right? I just wrote an article about this on Dow Jones publication Marketplace, about how this whole idea that we're headed for an online driven retail landscape is just not sustainable, like so many other things in our economy. And that actually is a good news message for brick and mortar and for downtown and Main Street in particular. Next slide. And why do I say it's a good news message for downtown and Main Street in particular? Because downtowns are actually pretty well positioned against e-commerce, right? And part of this is because downtowns have been at this adaptive response game for about 70 years now, right? I mean, with the rise of the mall, downtowns had to figure out another way of being, right? They had to establish another way to make themselves relevant. And while it took a little while, and there were a lot of aborted efforts in the 70s and the 80s, in the 90s, downtowns happened on a formula, which worked for a good quarter of a century, right? A formula based on, doubling down on their captive submarkets, whether those are workers, whether those are students, whether those are tourists, whether those are residents, really doubling down on placemaking and texture, and driving the retail with food, beverage, and entertainment. That was a very effective adaptive response to the regional mall, and it's also a very effective adaptive response once we get out of this pandemic to e-commerce, right? Because if you think about it, it's the strip malls and the enclosed malls that are actually more vulnerable. They're the ones that have always traded on selection, convenience, and price. The internet is considerably better at all three. Whereas the internet really can't do much about captive submarkets. They really can't offer much placemaking and texture. And until we have 3D printers that can basically put food, beverage, and entertainment online, they can't really do much about that either, right? And indeed, what's been fascinating about this pandemic and about the few years preceding it, when there was a supposed retail apocalypse, is that what's been hit harder and which downtowns actually struggled the most were the ones that were filled with large national brands. I'm working in two of them right now, downtown Westfield in New Jersey, downtown Walnut Creek in the San Francisco Bay Area. They're the ones that have been hit the hardest, right? Whereas the lion's share of downtowns dominated by small businesses have had far fewer closures, right? So that's one of the reasons downtown's well positioned for e-commerce, and indeed that's being borne out in the experiences of downtowns on the ground. Next slide. Okay, so let's get into what this experience has been in Connecticut and what that means for the future of downtown. Well, Connecticut was one of those states which enjoyed net in-migration. In 2020, 16,500 residents arrived versus a loss of 7,500 in 2019. Fairfield County localities in particular, they occupied 6 of the top destinations for in-migration across the state, not surprisingly. And a lot of that was just urban flight. Whether it's temporary or not is unclear. Urban flight from New York City, and a preference for those fleeing for suburban and also small town communities that sit within the commuter shed of that large employment center, right? And that's Connecticut really to a T. Connecticut, not just in Fairfield County, but also in some of the adjacent counties, and even on the other end of the state, vis-a-vis Boston, right? New Jersey benefited similarly in this regard with New York and Philadelphia, right? Also, drive-in tourist destinations actually had a pretty good 2020 and so far 2021. I'm working in 2 of them in Massachusetts, downtown Plymouth and downtown Hyannis. Both had record-breaking summers in 2020 and 2021. And that's because all of those trips that we used to be getting on a plane for, well, weren't really possible. And so what we did instead was we drove. and we drove to tourist destinations that were within a relatively quick drive. In Connecticut, that might have been Mystic, for instance. That might have been the northwestern corner of the state. Again, that benefited a state that's positioned like Connecticut has long been. Next slide. Now, in the current moment, we are clearly dealing with some challenges. Presumably, they are temporary. Our larger central business districts, like downtown Hartford, still struggling with getting people back into the office, with the resulting hit on foot traffic. Also, you've undoubtedly read about labor shortages, and also rising supply costs gotten a little less attention, but can be equally devastating to businesses. For restaurants, for instance, food and other supplies now 30 to 35% more expensive this year than they were last year. And all this creates profit margin pressures on those businesses. To the or if they're able to pass them along to you, the consumer, higher prices. I certainly experienced that. I just got back from a vacation in Cape Cod, and lobster has never been more expensive. And some of this, whether it's the labor shortages, the supply costs, and presumably the return to the office, is hopefully temporary. And if you think about the jolt that our economy was given in the last year and a half, that doesn't all just go back to normal overnight, especially with the Delta variant, but even without it, right? Those dislocations, those temporary dislocations would exist regardless. But on the brighter side, there's a lot that came out of this that actually bodes well. For one thing, I would suggest that the businesses that were able to survive have clearly proven themselves to be among the more resilient ones. Shopify has been a major force in dramatically lifting the percentage of small businesses with an online presence. Now with e-commerce, those businesses are capable of penetrating much larger trade areas than they were before. Also, and I've written about this as well, there was the assumption back last spring that retailers would stop growing. The ones that retained at least relatively healthy balance sheets actually saw it as a golden opportunity. As Warren Buffett has always said, you need as a business to be greedy while others are fearful. And a lot of retailers did just that. That's partly why so many businesses continued to open during a pandemic. They were looking beyond that. They realized this is a moment in time, whereas leases are for much longer than that, right? And they had the opportunity to lock in discounted prices on streets that ordinarily they would have no possibility of getting into, certainly at those prices. And they took that opportunity, right? Meanwhile, like with a lot of other economic downturns in the past, this one has resulted in a boom in entrepreneurial energy. A lot of new small businesses, the data has shown. Partly that's a result of higher savings. Partly it's low interest rates. Partly it's rising home equity. There was a 9% increase in new small business startups across Connecticut in 2020. So a lot of entrepreneurial energy. Also, to the extent that spaces did lose their tenants, there's now a lot of what are called second generation spaces. In restaurant industry, this is particularly important because those spaces already have their kitchens. And kitchens, you probably know, are easily the most expensive cost for any new restaurant. So when there are spaces, vacant spaces that already have those kitchens, they'll be snapped up in a hurry. Furthermore, you've got some pretty desperate landlords out there, and that's where this narrative of retail apocalypse is helping us. And you are seeing rents decline in the aggregate. Of course, there are some landlords out there who are kind of keeping their head in the sand. They're always going to exist. But generally speaking, rents are dropping. And that actually, in my experience, tends to lead to more interesting diversified retail mixes, which ultimately are a healthy thing for our downtowns. Next slide. Okay, so we've got this whole virtual economy, I call it. You include in that remote work, you include in that urban flight, you include in that what we're doing now, virtual conferences and meetings and less business travel. A lot of ink has been spilled on this subject. One point I'd like to say, while we're not sure how this is all going to settle, is to say that, again, as I noted earlier, just because we can do something, just because we can live a certain way, does not necessarily mean that we will. One of my favorite movies, partly because it to some degree reflected my pre-COVID life, was Up in the Air, starring George Clooney. And if you haven't seen that, he's basically someone who's hired to fire people by companies across the country. But the larger point was that he was in the air on the road about 300 days a year. And then the tension in the movie is that suddenly there's this technology which enables him to fire people on a screen, right? It was kind of prescient in that sense, right? And so suddenly he didn't have to be traveling 300 days a year. But what happened? That led him to despondency, because that's the life he loved, right? There's a complex psychology at work in determining how we live our lives, what we want, what we need, that we're not even necessarily aware of, right? And that's why I take these surveys we see today about how people say they will live their lives in the post-pandemic world with a grain of salt. Because remember how after 9/11, surveys showed no one would ever get on a plane again, no one would ever work in an office tower, no one would dine on an outdoor patio, no one would ever live in New York City, right? We all know how that ended, right? So I think that we should have the proper amount of humility in knowing that we don't know how this is all going to play out, but that it's a lot more complicated than I think most of the think pieces on the subject would make it out to be. But okay, let's just assume that yes, there will be some hybrid work, more than existed before. We'll be coming into the office 3 days a week rather than 5, for instance, right? Seems pretty safe to assume at this point. I'm not even sure that that's going to have the impact on retail that is often assumed. For instance, if I'm only going to the office 3 days a week, and I used to go 5, then I'm at home 2 days a week, making my lunch, saving money, right? So maybe on those 3 days, when I am in the office, I'm going to go out to eat all 3 days, right? Because I saved money in the other 2, right? And frankly, if all the cubicles are filled on any given day, it doesn't matter that the people are different. The consumer demand overall and its impact on the retail is going to be similar, right? My point is that we just don't know how this is going to play out, right? We don't know that it's going to lead to all of the horrible consequences that people seem to be assuming. Next slide. So if we look a little bit further back, Connecticut population grew only 1% in the 2010s, which you probably know is quite low by regional standards. Massachusetts grew 7%, even Rhode Island grew 4%. However, that's statewide. If you break that data down, which you might already have done, there was population growth in 6 of Connecticut's 7 largest cities. And there was population growth in the downtowns of Stamford, in the downtown of New Haven, in the downtown of Hartford, which was the one of those 7 cities that did not grow in the 2010s. The downtown did grow, right? So we clearly have an ongoing urbanization in this state, irrespective of the relatively stagnant population growth overall. Next slide. Now, part of what's going on here is generational change, right? We've spent the last 15, 20 years trying to figure out these millennials, right? You know, how do they like to live? How do they spend money? What do they spend money on? Yes, they like experiences rather than goods, although that obviously changed a lot during the pandemic because we couldn't really have any experiences. But what's happening now is that those millennials are now in family formation and home buying stage, right? And just like people in that life stage in the past, they're suburbanizing. They're looking for more room at a lower price. This was already happening before COVID. And a lot of the suburbanization during COVID, for instance, a lot of Fairfield County growth was simply pulled forward, pulling forward what was for demographic reasons likely to happen anyway. What's noteworthy about it, however, is that these suburbanizers spent the last 20 years living an urban lifestyle, and they, as opposed to suburbanizers of past generations, are taking their urbanity with them, creating this phenomenon which I call the suburbanization of hip. And we've even seen some exurbanization of hip, little pockets of urbanity with a more contemporary look and feel, with artisanal coffee houses, ramen joints, brew pubs, retro men's barbershops popping up in places they never would have in previous generations. They certainly didn't exist in Irvington on Hudson, New York, where I grew up in Westchester County, right? So our retail mixes are changing as a result. Meanwhile, it's Gen Z that will now be increasingly replacing millennials in our urban downtowns. And we shouldn't assume that they will be exactly the same, as most observers seem to be doing, right? Now, Connecticut oddly experienced a dramatic decline in the under 18 population in the 2010s, about 10% drop, although more of that was in smaller towns than larger towns and cities. It does, however, beg the question of whether affordability, especially in a place like Fairfield County, is part of the explanation for that. The other piece of this, where we've still got some uncertainty, obviously we did a lot of home living during the pandemic, right? We bought kitchen utensils and equipment, right? And some of us bought exercise bikes. Some of us were lucky enough to have enough money to buy a Peloton bike, right? It's called the Peloton economy. To what extent does that stick, right, is the big question. And finally, there was, as I said, clearly a strong preference for shopping local during the pandemic. We don't know if that will endure either. We'd like to think it will. Past evidence suggests we shouldn't be so sure. But again, these will all affect our downtown retail in significant ways. Next slide. Some other uncertainties we're facing. Politics and policy. Before the pandemic, we saw a growing interest in storefront vacancy taxes. In fact, certain cities across the country actually passed storefront vacancy taxes, most notably San Francisco. We even had a Hartford City Councilor proposing one this year. Those sorts of policies, while well-intentioned, often reflect kind of a very simplistic understanding of how things work in storefront retail and why spaces are vacant when they are. It's a little bit dispiriting to me that there seems to be a doubling down on those sorts of interventions and even less of a concern about unintended consequences. But that's something which can affect our downtowns as well. Landlord flexibility, I mentioned before, they're getting more flexible because they're increasingly desperate, but that goes both ways. Desperate shopping center owners are starting to add the sorts of independent retailers that normally have been the exclusive province of downtowns and main streets, right? And they're getting more flexible with their lease rates in order to do so. So there's an increased competition in that regard, right? You're starting to see vintage clothiers in a suburban shopping center, in a Class A suburban shopping center, right? And you're starting to see chef-driven restaurants in a Class A suburban shopping center. It would have been unimaginable 2 decades ago, or even a decade ago, right? That's going to be a threat. But even more broadly, shopping centers are trying to co-opt what makes downtowns unique, like their sense of place. This image is of Centennial Real Estate's plans for a new central plaza to anchor a redeveloped Connecticut Post Mall, which would host concerts, outdoor dining, farmers markets, other outdoor events. Sound familiar, right? New Haven Register article said as follows: ultimately, the company's concept is to essentially turn the mall inside out. Stores located in a climate-controlled indoor environment will be moved into a new take on the old concept of downtown shopping districts, with plenty of public space for good measure, right? Sounds familiar. Now, you might scoff at what will clearly appear like a knockoff of the real thing, but for a lot of consumers, it will be close enough. And downtown needs to up its game and does what it does best, but even better: come up with new categories, concepts, and formats that keep it ahead of the curve like it always has. Because the competition actually is only going to get more formidable. Right? Next slide. So now I want to spend a few slides on what this new retail paradigm is going to look like and what kinds of retail are actually expanding now. Right? Certainly food and beverage will remain front and center, but in particular, fast casual dining versus sit-down dining. Chef-driven. What's been very interesting is what I would call the Shake Shackification of dining, where even your celebrity chefs and restaurateurs are realizing there's far more profit to be made in fast casual formats. That's why Danny Meyer is putting most of his eggs these days in Shake Shack and other fast casual concepts. So there's a proliferation of these smaller ones like chainlets, but also larger franchisees that are growing very aggressively right now. What's interesting about downtowns is that a lot of the larger franchisees, or a lot of larger franchises are overcorrecting towards suburbs. They're overcorrecting towards drive-through, towards pickup and takeout, right? Because again, they're just extrapolating from the present. And to me, that's a permanent response to what was a temporary problem. Certainly off-premise dining is here to stay, but to reorient most of your fleet, most of your real estate portfolio in that direction is probably an overreaction. But what it does is it creates an opportunity for downtowns to really focus in on those smaller operators, those smaller chainlets, who now don't have to compete necessarily with the Panera Breads of the world. And you even see this with Starbucks. You might have seen Starbucks is actually backing away from the third place role that it had kind of pioneered in this country, right? It's closing or relocating a lot of its downtown locations across the country. And the ones that are remaining are becoming more about pickup rather than sit in. Again, an opportunity for smaller chainlet and independent coffee houses to fill that void, right? So for our downtowns, that might be a happy outcome of all this. Food halls, obviously, Connecticut's getting in on this game, albeit a little late, but the Parkville Market in Hartford, there's now another one soon to open in East Rock, in New Haven. You've probably heard a lot about ghost kitchens. I would be worried about ghost kitchens near downtowns and main streets unless they are combined with a food hall. Otherwise, they could take storefronts and have basically no presentation to the street because they are not public-facing operations unless they're combined with a food hall. And then, of course, craft alcohol, craft beer, and also craft liquor, distilleries. That's going to continue to be a growth area. Generally, the rule of thumb, there's about one craft brewery in this country for every 37,000 people. You can apply that to your market and then compare it to how many craft breweries actually exist and use that as a rough guide for whether more could be supported. But those will continue to grow as well. Next slide. There's an ever more diversified array of entertainment options. When I was young and when I was in college, it was pretty much all about beer and drinking it to excess. And thankfully, we moved a little bit beyond that. There's a wider range of concepts that while they might sell alcohol to pay the bills, that's not their primary draw. Barcades, for instance, that use food and beverage to pay the bills, but the marketing gimmick is all about video games, right? And indeed, gaming is a critical phenomenon to understand right now for Gen Z in particular. That is their new public square, right? And whether it's larger esports arenas or more modestly sized gaming lounges, that is the third place or one of the third places that will become ever more popular among Gen Z. But also do-it-yourself creative studios. You're probably well familiar with Paint and Sip. Those have been around for a while, but that's diversifying as well. Now there are do-it-yourself ceramic studios or wood signs, candles. And then finally, and this is a particularly intriguing one, if you ever spent any time in Japan, you're familiar with these. They're known as purikura in Japan. Basically, it's basically a storefront full of photo booths, old school photo booths that have been kind of revamped as selfie stations, where you could, have your picture taken with all sorts of decorations that you add to your face. And this is big business in Japan. They're starting to appear in this country, even in suburban downtowns. One's just opened in downtown Westfield in New Jersey. Again, could see this being wildly popular with Gen Z. Next slide. Daily and weekly needs. Of course, there's always, we need a grocery store. I hear that pretty much everywhere I work. What's interesting is that some of the larger traditionally big box retailers are finally starting to create formats that work for smaller footprints in downtown Main Street settings. Target's gotten the most press for this, but there are others. Dollar General, you might not have the highest opinion of them, but they have a format called DGX, which is kind of a small sort of daily needs kind of retailer. It's kind of a combination of what you find in a drugstore, sans pharmacy, and what you find in a convenience store. But there's no indication that it has anything to do with Dollar General or a dollar store. In fact, there's ones in some pretty high income neighborhoods. For those downtowns that can't attract a small format Target, that could offer an alternative. Pet supplies, remember when I mentioned all those categories that did really well during the pandemic? A lot of them, again, that demand was pulled forward. I wouldn't expect the growth to be sustainable. How many times can you buy a couch, for instance, or outfit a home office? But pets are something different, right? There were a lot of pet adoptions last year, and that's going to be the one gift that keeps on giving for retail, right? Because that means a decade or more of pet supply, grooming, daycare, vets, animal hospitals, pet bakery, pet-friendly restaurants. We were already seeing that before the pandemic. There will only be more of that now. Healthcare retail, you've probably heard about. There's kind of this retailification of healthcare, whether urgent care centers, but also primary care. And then, of course, a recreational pot recently legalized in Connecticut. Those licenses aren't going to be issued until late 2022 at the earliest. But my picture up on the right there shows that these don't necessarily have to be an aesthetic negative for your Main Street. They can look quite attractive. And in fact, many of them do in other states. And so from a cosmetic and indeed marketing perspective, they might not be the drag that sometimes people worry about. Finally, boutique fitness obviously took a gut punch during the pandemic, but a lot of the franchises are continuing to grow. So I would expect to see ever more of those as well. Next slide. Okay, finally, soft goods. You know, and soft goods, by soft goods, I mean generally clothing, shoes, home furnishings. You know, there's this, again, this narrative that this aspect of brick and mortar retail is dead. Now, I've never believed that. I think most successful downtowns have retained at least a healthy collection of boutiques, playing at least a supportive role to the primary food and beverage draws. But now, because of some of what I've been saying, these opportunities actually are multiplying, not contracting. For one thing, the treasure hunt, right? The whole experience of finding hidden gems at steep discounts amidst piles of junk, right? Whether that's vintage, whether that's consignment, whether that's thrift, whatever you want to call it, right? It's having a moment right now, right? What's really different as opposed to 10, 15 years ago, they've lost their stigma. And so there's real crossover potential. And most importantly, they're relatively immune to e-commerce. This is not an experience that we as consumers have shown any interest in having online. We prefer to do it in stores. The biggest treasure hunt retailers, your TJ Maxx's of the world, your Burlingtons, your Ross Dress for Less, two of those three don't even sell online. And the third, TJ Maxx, only generates about 1% of its retail sales online, 1 to 2%, right? So treasure hunt is something which clearly people prefer to do in person and is going to remain brick and mortar for quite some time. Also, all those, what I mentioned earlier, those digitally native brands, right? The ones that started online and have realized that, hey, they actually have to start opening stores. Well, they've been doing a lot of that even before COVID. Warby Parker, Bonobos, Casper, Untuckit, Allbirds, even Amazon, right? They've all realized it's got to be clicks and bricks. And many of them are actually looking very closely at downtowns, right? Particularly downtowns that are quite healthy. Mall refugees. Connecticut is a state that has a relatively lackluster collection of malls given its affluence and density, right? I mean, especially before SONO collection, but even now, which means that there's a lot of weak malls out there with still some strong tenants who might not want to be in those malls anymore and who might no longer have to stay in those malls because of what's known as co-tenancy clauses, which allow them to leave those malls if department store anchors close, right? They'll be looking for somewhere else. A lot of them will head to grocery anchored strip malls because that's where that grocery stores, especially after pandemic, are seen as the most stable anchors. But they will also head to healthy downtowns, right? So those mall refugees. Next slide. But also, and this is a growing trend, you should not underestimate the role that local celebrities can play in creating new and ultimately far-reaching retail concepts. Perhaps the best example of this is downtown Waco, Texas, which, as most of you know, was known for something very different 10 or 15 years ago. You know, and Chip and Joanna Gaines from the HGTV show basically transformed it into a major tourist destination. They're from there. They went to college there, and they made it their home as adults, and basically turned it into a major tourist destination. And this has happened in smaller towns too with other celebrities. Also athletes, Marshawn Lynch, good example of this, the former NFL running back. He has his Beast Mode brand. He's opened stores in Oakland, Seattle, Las Vegas. But more broadly, what might be baffling to some of you is that these days there's a notion that anyone can start a product line as long as they have a social media following. Those are the ecosystems millennials and Gen Z live in. And so we need to look deeper for what opportunities they might present for downtown retail as well, right? And some of this is about providing the platforms where those sorts of creators and influencers, as they're called, can actually sell their products from. They might not want or be able to occupy permanent storefronts. But if there are other sorts of platforms, and I'll get into those in a moment, that can provide them with an opening in your downtown. So let me finish with a few slides about what public and the nonprofit sector more broadly, mainstream organizations, bids, in partnership with their municipalities can do to help build back better, in the words of the day, right? And one role they can play is in creating and operating these very platforms, whether they're public markets. There's even examples of those already. I mean, Middletown obviously has its Main Street Market, for instance, but there are many bids across the country that have taken on this responsibility, whether it's pods of fashion trucks, whether it's shipping container villages, right? Or even just as a matchmaker for co-location with two or more businesses occupying the same space, right? There are ways in which the public nonprofit sector can help to harness all that entrepreneurial energy, right? And by doing so, not only will they lower barriers to entry, they will be cultivating permanent tenants, as some of them will ultimately become permanent storefront tenants. And most importantly, they will provide a sense of constant discovery, because that's what retail is all about these days. After decades of generic malls that didn't seem to change, the watchword today is to give people reasons to keep coming back by constantly switching up and rotating what you're offering. And that also applies to retail mix, right? Even malls are doing that. Department stores are doing that, finding little ways to tinker with their product mixes so that you have reasons to come back. And that's what these entrepreneurial platforms can do for our downtowns. Next slide. Playing a role in tenant recruitment. And this is partly about filling gaps in the existing incentive structure. If you think about it, landlords and commission-based brokers, they are incentivized to focus on individual spaces, not on entire districts, right? That's your role, right? And there are many different ways in which you could play that role, whether it's as kind of in creating a sort of leasing brochure in print and digital formats that sells the district as a whole, not just an individual space. Or perhaps even in prospecting and vetting tenants that can help to create a more cohesive mix and further community goals. Because the reality is that a landlord and their broker isn't incentivized for doing anything more than thinking about their individual space that they're trying to fill, right? They are not incentivized to think in terms of cohesion and synergy or community goals. That's not how the system is structured right now. So there's a gap, there's a vacuum, which only you as the public nonprofit sector can fill. But also by doing this, you can prove your worth to those stakeholders. As many of us know, landlords and brokers don't always take us seriously, right? Oh, you know, it's the public's nonprofit. Oh, yeah, they don't really understand retail, or yeah, they're not really going to help me. They can only get in my way. This is a way of proving your worth. And there are many communities where I've helped my client to play this sort of role where it's had that effect, right? Where landlords and brokers feel like, wow, they're actually helping me, right? They're supporting me in meaningful ways. Barcade, for instance, was a tenant that we helped to lure to 9th Square in downtown New Haven, for instance. And that's something which actually speaks the language that these stakeholders typically speak. Next slide. Modernizing land use, zoning, and regulatory regimes. The reality is that most of our zoning codes are suffice it to say, old and outdated, right? And even if they were up to date, the reality is that this industry is changing very quickly. And that means there's a need to make sure that these regimes accommodate this rapid evolution. For one thing, retailers are not necessarily seeing storefronts just as a place to sell goods. For the reasons I mentioned earlier, they're about visibility. They might be about online fulfillment, using the backs of the stores for online fulfillment. They might even be about using the backs of the stores for streaming studios, right? These are uses which your zoning codes need to accommodate, and explicitly so. Because even if you say, oh yeah, we'd be okay with that, we'd allow that to pass as long as retail is the primary use. For a retailer, there's still too much discretion in that and not enough predictability. They want to know for sure that if they're going to take a chance on something and invest their time and resources, that is a pretty high likelihood that it will be approved, right? But also in a lot of my downtowns where I'm working, there's calls from certain property owners to allow them to consider non-retail uses in their ground floor. And that requires quite a bit of nuance, because on your primary retail streets, it's dangerous to let those spaces go, because that's one less space that could add to the synergy of what's left, and that can add to the critical mass of what's left. And that's so important on a district-wide level, right? Whereas on other streets, it might be less dangerous to allow that sort of flexibility. So some sort of tiered approach. But from what I could tell, a lot of land use and zoning codes at this point don't really incorporate any of that. Next slide. Okay, owning a meaningful identity. And this is all about what I would say is your district, your main street, breaking through the noise and staying relevant, which to me means offering something special and remaining one step ahead. Remember what I said about shopping centers co-opting what makes downtowns distinctive. Downtowns have to remain one step ahead. And that's about really having an identity that means something. Put simply, consumers are going to default to what's convenient, and main streets have never been convenient, right? The burden is on us then to make those consumers choose differently and to show why downtown is different from the others, right? This is partly a matter of marketing and branding. If you look at this banner on the lower right, what on earth does that banner say that really differentiates that downtown? I see so many banners that really don't say anything, or anything that's particularly relevant to a consumer choosing about where to spend their money. What is your unique selling proposition? Why should the consumer come here and not somewhere else? What can they get here that they can't get at the competition? This is also partly a matter of your core customer and really honing in on that. So many special events these days, they're great, and they're special events that have happened every year for years and decades, right? But they don't necessarily target anyone. They just target everyone. And to me, events also should be about those specific demographic and psychographic submarkets most likely to spend money in your businesses, right? And that's a purpose that is often, all too often overlooked. And it's also about communications that establish a presence within the ecosystems of those submarkets. If, for example, you're trying to reach Gen Z, you had better be saying something real on TikTok, right? So again, owning a meaningful identity, which, and to be blunt, a lot of main streets fall short in this regard, of saying something that actually cuts through, right? Next slide. And part of this is a matter of design and programming, right? All of this pandemic era outdoor dining has presented us with an opportunity, a renewed kind of openness to reimagine public space in ways that can help downtowns to differentiate themselves in the marketplace. For one thing, as I said, shopping centers are trying to do this themselves, right? So we need to outflank them. But it's also about establishing a 21st century anchor. We no longer have large retailers in most of our downtowns, right? Those anchors do not exist anymore. It's public space that can be that new anchor, right? And also speaking to younger generations, there's a clear generational shift in downtowns about issues such as parking, automobile primacy, and all too often, these discussions happen independent of those attitudes, right? These discussions are driven by boomers and Gen Xers like me, who had a very different experience of downtowns pre-1990s, right? And we need to be aware of that disconnect as well. And finally, and this is perhaps controversial in your downtown, downtowns and retail in general, they happen in a sort of evolutionary process. It's rare that you can do something in a big splash sort of way that overnight is going to fundamentally transform your downtown. It has happened on occasion, but most of the time when downtowns revive, right, when they reemerge, it's a much more gradual evolution. And it starts with those early adopters, and then it goes to that early majority, and then it heads further along. This is a chart that I kind of, oh, sorry, go to the next slide. I'm sorry. This is a chart that I took from the tech world, which shows how technological innovations are generally adopted, but I feel it pretty much fits my experience in downtowns as well, right? And the problem a lot of us make, right, in downtown and Main Street circles is we focus on the far right, the laggards, the loudest ones who complain about not being able to park in front of the store, who complain about the one homeless person they see on the street every other month, who are never really going to come anytime soon anyway. And we do not focus on the next sort of tranche of consumers after the stage we're currently in. So if we're at the early adopter stage, we ignore the early majority, the ones who are kind of on the fence, who could be convinced, and we still spend most of our time listening to and trying to respond to those laggards, right? My attitude is forget the laggards, at least for now, right? Ultimately, they will come along, right? They are not your lowest hanging fruit at this point, right? And especially after COVID, you now know who your diehards are. They were the ones who kept spending on your main streets in April of 2020, right? Those are the ones you spend most of your energy catering to, right? Downtowns are not for everyone anymore, at least not in these early stages, right? And we can't be thinking about them in those terms. Next slide. Okay, so last two slides. Back to Mark Twain and my larger point. Hopefully you start to see how crazy it is to talk of any sort of new normal in the ever dynamic field of retail. Hopefully you start to understand how things can evolve over time in funny and often unpredictable ways. As if to further emphasize the point, let's consider the long and winding route road of that book selling has taken over the last 40 years. If we're old enough, we remember the movie, I think it was early 90s, You've Got Mail, where Meg Ryan at peak cuteness had her shop around the corner that was about to be obliterated by Tom Hanks' Fox Books monolith, which was clearly an imitation of Barnes & Noble, right? Then we had Amazon. It emerged in the mid-90s, and very quickly we started to buy our books online, so that even Fox Books was in deep trouble, right? And that famous New Yorker cover where you've got the person upstairs from the independent bookseller who's waving good morning to the merchant, in the process accepting their Amazon package, right? And that was the way this category went, right? Well, a funny thing happened, right? What happened was that basically Amazon was so successful, we no longer have borders. Barnes & Noble is a fraction of its former self. Amazon was so successful that it created a vacuum, right? It created a vacuum which was filled, amazingly enough, by independent booksellers. The number of independent booksellers in this country rose every year between 2010 and 2020, right? Increased 50% in 10 years, right? And now, again, funny and often unpredictable ways, right? Now, who's opening bookstores? Amazon. I don't think anyone could have predicted that this is the path that bookselling would have taken, right? But what it suggests is that the damage done by large threats like e-commerce, they actually create vacuums, right? Into which our downtowns and main streets can step. And the reality about our downtowns and main streets and about small business in general is that we only need a small fraction of the demand. We only need to occupy a certain niche to be really healthy, right? Unlike a Barnes & Noble, right? And that spells opportunity. Last slide. So this has been a very difficult year and a half for brick and mortar retail, for downtowns. Not as bad as had been feared, but difficult all the same. And again, we do not quite know where it's all headed. Lots of scary headlines, people leaving dense urban places, working from home, shopping from home, eating at home, watching movies from home, exercising at home, never stepping outside again. We have a lot of talk about meeting people where they are, which in this case means never meeting them in person at all. I, for one, am not buying it. Not only does it all underestimate these complex psychological forces that drive us to do what we do, but also there are a lot of people with dogs in this fight, and they're not going to go gently into this good night. Those scary headlines assume, for one, that retail will stand still and that retailers will resign themselves to a future of losing money. They won't. I'm reminded of this when I think about John Mackey, college dropout on the left of these photos, who transformed the humdrum business of buying groceries into the saliva-inducing theater that is Whole Foods, revolutionizing the supermarket industry in the process. Or Howard Schultz, lowly kitchen equipment salesman from blue-collar Brooklyn, who built Starbucks coffee from virtually nothing, and who in the span of just 2 decades, love it or hate it, almost single-handedly created the modern third place coffee house. Or Steve Jobs, who certainly did not just meet customers where they are, but who in the midst of a deep recession in the late 1970s, dared to offer them something better, something they did not even know they wanted. Because as he was fond of saying, that's the point of a paradigm shift. Most people do not know it is coming. There are many others who are striving, just like Mackey, Schultz, and Jobs did, to build better brick and mortar mousetraps. The future belongs to them. You might not recognize their names. Most of them do not work at the well-known brands, but they're out there. And just as it was for Whole Foods, Starbucks, and Apple, building robust networks of physical stores in downtowns, main streets, and everywhere is most assuredly part of their vision, because it has to be. So whatever the future brings, we're on the cusp of something right now. And I, for one, am excited to see where it all ends up. I hope that after this morning, you'll be a little more inclined to join me and play your part and make it happen. Thank you.
Mike, thank you so much. I won't presume to speak for everyone, but I personally find, not surprisingly, that of course you're so energetic, you're inspirational, and you're challenging all of us with practical, actionable advice and recommendations. So I thank you very much for that. A couple of quick questions that we have. First of all, I'll Delia asks, and I'll follow up with you on this, can we possibly get a JPEG or a clearer image of your evolutionary chart?
Yes.
Because that's such a great tool. And I think people really need to look closely at that and then share it amongst themselves. So that would be really great. I'll follow up with you. I have a question about pot dispensaries, as you noted, coming online in Connecticut later on in 2022.
Yep.
I've seen several of them in Denver and have talked with a couple of boutique owners that were going out of business at the time because in that particular case, close to Union Station, they were being priced out of their spaces by pot dispensaries that could pay higher rents. And so this is something we all need to be concerned about on Main Street and otherwise related to retail. So what have you observed on that? Are property owners able to exact higher rents from dispensaries than boutique and small businesses that may have been there already?
Yes, I do think that is, that could happen, and it could also happen in the labor market as well. I know early on in Colorado, which was really kind of the tip of the spear for this, there were concerns and at least anecdotal evidence. I wouldn't want to say systematically arrived at evidence, but anecdotal evidence that pot dispensaries could pay more than restaurants, than bars. So, you know, you've already got at least hopefully a temporary labor shortage in the hospitality industry. Presumably by the time these come online, that will have resolved. But yeah, those are definitely considerations that should be incorporated into the conversation about how we regulate this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think community, you know, there's two trains of thought. I think about, you know, one, limiting the number of retail dispensaries in a given community, which can be tricky because I find that municipalities aren't always the best at estimating demand and usually make these decisions on the basis of other more subjective criteria. But on the other hand, if you let the market, you know, kind of settle, you know, kind of make sense of all this, you know, again, I draw on my recent vacation in Wellfleet in Cape Cod, which is a town of 3,500 people, and basically has said whoever wants a pot dispensary can get it. And they now have 4 pot dispensaries, which even with the summer peak traffic, you know, they're basically betting that, okay, 1 or 2 of these will probably not make it. But let them sort that out. And, you know, I think there's good reason to approach it that way too, because the market sometimes is better at sorting it all out. But, you know, there's different ways of approaching it. And I think all of that has to be part of the conversation about how you regulate this, and making sure that all of the impacts, including the ones you mentioned, are part of that analysis.
Great. Another question here. You know, I know that one of my pieces of advice to our members and to the Connecticut Main Street Network is to, once we have this recording up on our website, which we will be sharing with everybody, is to think about scheduling a watch party for your Planning and Zoning Commission, for your EDCs, for your business and property owners. I know our friends in Simsbury are doing that right now at Town Hall. So kudos to all of you. But aside from that, which I think could be really helpful, because I think getting a number of people in the room to hear this, you know, when they all have the same district in mind and to talk about it can be really helpful. What other advice do you have? You know, most of the attendees today and the people that are going to be watching this are on the front lines with their Main Street retailers and their property owners. So, and as you know very well, because you've worked a lot in Connecticut, we have a lot of small towns in Connecticut, a lot of rural Main Streets in Connecticut. Yeah. So how can they take this information and help their retailers and property owners better understand the future, better understand how to prepare?
Yeah, I mean, you know, 2 things I'll say first is, you know, all of you in the audience on the front lines, you're a large reason why these last 18 months have not been that extinction level event, to be honest, because you were really in the trenches, and you still are in the trenches. The second thing I'll say, and this kind of goes for your larger point, Kim, is that as much as I've tried to kind of generalize on some of these ideas, they are very place specific. For instance, a downtown and the merchants in it can have a very different situation confronting them if they're pretty much the only game in town, versus there's a formidable shopping center competitor 2 miles away. That can make all the difference, not only in their prospects, but also in how they position themselves in terms of merchandising, in terms of marketing, and also to kind of tease out, even if there isn't such a competitor, will one emerge in the future? So much of it is place specific. I'll say that. Maybe the one thing that small businesses, I think, there's a lot of talk these days about how much data we have, right? And how great that all is and how wonderful it's going to be for retail. We do have a lot of data right now. I don't think most people know really what to do with it all. And so all of that data is actually creating a lot more challenges than opportunities. Just look at the barrage of data we get from the CDC and how to make sense of all that, right? Big data is not necessarily an advantage. Having said that, small businesses now know a lot more about their customer base than they did 18 months ago. And they certainly know who their diehards are, right? They have a much clearer sense, if they didn't already, right, of, well, these are the ones who will stick with me. This is my floor, right? And maybe in addition to figuring out how I could expand that sort of draw to include more customers, how can I, and this is going to sound a little bit cynical, how can I get more money from my diehards, right? I've always believed from a marketing perspective, whether you're talking about a business, a district, what have you, it's actually a lot easier and generally cheaper to try to get more from what you already know you have than try to spin your wheels trying to get something that you don't, right?
Yeah.
And I think now, after these last 18 months, we know a lot more about what we have. And we can mine that data. I know that isn't necessarily a satisfying answer in speaking to the broad range of small businesses across the state, but I think it does hold as a general concept that we're a lot further along in how we understand our opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That and it brings me back to your evolutionary chart. What you just said, together with that graphic, I think helps business owners better get their brains around speaking to which market, not speaking to everybody and not dealing with the laggards, but really, really break down for them, for their own business, who's at the top of that.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, even beyond the scale of the individual businesses, for the district, for the mainstream organization, or the bid that you're talking about, the special events they hold. Like I was saying, how can these special events be positioned or structured so that they really zero in on getting more from your core customer, rather than just kind of this general mass market approach of, oh, this is a fun event, we've always had it, this is how it's always been, we're doing it again. I think the time of when downtown could be and was all things to all people has passed. And I think that follows through not just for the individual business, but also for the district.
Yeah, good. I know we are bucking up against time here. We do have a couple more questions, and Mike, with your permission, what I'd like to do is shoot those over to you afterwards, and just have you respond to those. And then we do, in addition to putting our recording up on our website, Judith is always really great about putting the chat and the responses to
Great.
chat up there. So we'll do that.
Sure.
So what I want to do right now, as long as this is cooperating with me, I just want to do a quick plug for our next program, which ties in with where Mike just left off. The next program in our Recovery and Resiliency on Main Street series is Small Things That Make a Big Difference on October 27th at 10 a.m. That will be a webinar. This program will feature case studies of creative use of reclaiming pavement, of programming public space, and creating pedestrian connections that make downtown more welcoming, more equitable places. And this program features initiatives that any community, large or small, can take on. Our guest presenters will include Matt Conway, the Executive Director of the Rise Up Group in Connecticut Murals, and Wynn Davis, Executive Director of the Town Green Special Services District in New Haven. And we'll have an additional presenter that I'm finalizing right now. A reminder, as I've said many times, the recording of today's session will be available on our website, ctmainstreet.org, where you can find lots of information no matter what stage of revitalization you're in. For instance, you can access our Reopen Downtown video series produced by our friends at Arnett, Muldrow and Associates. And they're short videos that can be watched at any time and shared with your local businesses. So thank you, Mike, so much, Michael Byrne, and thank all of you. And we look forward to seeing you on Main Street.